Hello everyone, and welcome to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 50 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Lead clouds heavily veiled the night sky. The full moon would hide and then reappear on the dark expanse. It seemed that at any moment, the rain could begin again, a cold, bone-chilling autumn rain. A mournful wind howled and, descending from above to the ground, grew tired of playing with the maize stalks. The weather was rapidly deteriorating. A tall man was running through the cornfield, not paying attention to his path. His old boots, caked with mud, frequently stuck in the wet ground. He often looked back, like a hunted animal. Any second now, the chase would catch up to him. About 40 meters away, flashlight beams pierced through the earth. They constantly shouted at him, ordering him to stop. He was surrounded. There was only one way out. He had to reach the center of the field. Once again, his black cloak snagged on the stalks. Roaring angrily, the fleeing man quickly shrugged it off and threw it to the ground. At this moment, it was nothing but extra weight and a burden. Glancing around predatorily, the bulging-eyed brunette paused for a couple of seconds and listened. The corn rustled from all sides. He was trapped, laughing bitterly. The man drew a knife from his boot and, mustering his last strength, darted toward the center. "Ashworth, we order you to stop. Resistance is futile. You are surrounded. If you resist, we will open fire," came the amplified voice of officers through a crackling loudspeaker. The fugitive merely chuckled dryly. They would neither capture him nor kill him. The man reached the center of the cornfield, taking several deep breaths. He dropped to his knees and brought the knife to his throat. Now, all that remained was to wait for witnesses. Without them, the ritual was useless. His lips moved quickly, muttering a prayer in a language incomprehensible to the average person. Meanwhile, the circle was closing in. A few seconds later, a bright light hit the fugitive's eyes, and he was ordered to drop the knife. He responded only with a malevolent smile, and, with a swift, practiced motion, slashed his throat. Warm blood spurted like a fountain, soaking the already wet ground and drenching the corn. Strangely, it seemed as though the stalks absorbed the scarlet liquid. "Elijah, what happened?" came the voice of a major pushing through the corn. "Bennett, he slit his throat," the young lieutenant said in a daze. Well, muttered the stout, mustachioed officer, scratching his head. "Guess he won't be going where he was supposed to." "Say, who was he anyway?" "Lieutenant Spencer. When will you start reading the bulletins?" The major exhaled noisily. "That's Franklin Ashworth, a serial killer and religious fanatic. He killed about 9 women. Those are just the ones we know of. In reality, there could be many more. He stripped them, cut their tendons so they couldn't escape, strangled them, painted symbols on their bodies, and then slit their throats. Sacrificed them. To whom? It's unknown. Our experts couldn't figure out who the victims were meant for. It seems," the major glanced at the maniac's corpse, "we were dealing with an ordinary schizophrenic. It's a shame we won't be able to interrogate him. We could have learned a lot, and it's a shame we didn't catch him. There goes our bonus. Now the credit will all go to the investigative committee, or someone else, but not us. So what now? Do we wait here?" Theodore asked. "Why bother? This is no longer our concern. Go to the car. I'll meet the others. Let them know where the body is, and we'll head back to the station. Listen, Bennett, while chasing him I saw a cloak. Looks like it's his. If so, it's evidence," the lieutenant persisted. "Forget it. Someone else will handle it. A cloak is just a cloak. If it's evidence, they'll take it. Go. Warm up the car," the seasoned officer replied wearily, heading to meet his colleagues. Theodore shook his head involuntarily and slowly trudged toward the highway, parting the corn stalks before him and lighting his way with a flashlight. The leaden sky was split by a golden lightning bolt, and moments later, thunder rumbled with a deafening echo as a cold, dreary rain began to fall. As the first drop landed on the killer's face, his slightly parted lips curved into a faint smile, and a cryptic gleam clouded his lifeless eyes. The ritual had succeeded. A 22-year-old young man stood grinning broadly, watching the swaying corn in the warm wind. The stalks, beginning to yellow, moved faintly, producing a rustle akin to a mystical, unintelligible whisper. Soon, the corn would fully ripen, and the first harvest would be ready. The black-haired youth surveyed his newly acquired property with a proprietary air, imagining himself a true farmer. When he heard rumors about the sale of the long-abandoned field, he immediately contacted the owner and arranged the purchase, but with one condition. He would buy the land closer to autumn, and by then, it had to be planted. The owner agreed to the unusual terms and, after the youth secured a substantial loan, completed the deal with him. As a result, Marcus now stood before his own field, gazing with undisguised pleasure at the nearly ripe corn. Of course, he fantasized. In his dreams, he saw himself as a successful farmer living far from the hustle of the city and selling maize. He planned to spend cold evenings sipping bourbon of his own making. "So, how's it going, farmer?" came a woman's voice from behind, startling the young man out of his thoughts. "You scared me, Mom," Marcus muttered, then smiled again. "Good. Just thinking about where to sell all this corn. I called a couple of stores, but they want it already cleaned and dried. Might have to take out another loan." "Ah, Marcus, you're such a dreamer," said Catherine Whitmore, squeezing her son's hand gently. "But I know you'll manage, especially since with your job, you can work from here, too." The young man nodded silently. Luckily, he had been interested in programming since school. When the country experienced a labor shortage in IT a few years ago, his skills came in handy. Accelerated courses, persistence, and hard work paid off, and for the past 6 months, he had been working remotely. The main thing was that the pay was very good, so he, the newly minted farmer, could take out more loans without fear of missing payments and was already eyeing a used pickup truck. But first, he needed to carry out a full renovation of his new home, buy furniture, and get internet installed, or at least purchase a satellite dish. To be honest, Marcus hadn't yet thought about how he would work, but he knew for certain that he would do it on his own land, gazing at cornfields. "But I still don't really like the house. It's kind of creepy," the woman quietly said, looking at the 2-story dwelling. "Mom, it just needs a coat of paint and some tidying up. After all, we're out in the sticks, or rather, outside the city limits," the young man said, smiling. No, Catherine Whitmore shook her head. "You said it right the first time. In the sticks. But you, of course, are a dreamer. A programmer farmer. A wonderful combination. And when are you bringing Duke? It'll feel a bit safer with him around." In a couple of days, Marcus waved her off. Duke was the name of a 2-year-old dog with a black and brown coat and a proud Alley Terrier breed. Unlike pedigree dogs, this mutt, who had grown to just above knee height, wasn't afraid of frost, rain, or wind. He ate anything and could sleep anywhere. The young man planned to bring the dog in a few days. After all, outside the city limits, it would be calmer with a dog around. And in the future, like a true farmer, he intended to get a license and buy a shotgun. Suddenly, behind them, the corn rustled loudly, and a cross-eyed old man emerged, parting the stalks. He was dressed in ragged black and gray clothing, and his chin was adorned with an unkempt gray beard. The old man was a head shorter than Marcus, but he was stocky and had a sturdy build. To Marcus, he resembled a dwarf, albeit cross-eyed and with a strong smell of alcohol. The old man stretched his lips into a semblance of a smile, revealing gums with no teeth. Then he casually spat on the ground and spoke. "So, neighbors, huh? What are your names, neighbors?" His hoarse, raspy voice was grating. Marcus didn't rush to introduce himself. On the contrary, he clenched his fists and looked at the uninvited guest with obvious hostility, especially after the man spat on his land. Catherine Whitmore, folding her arms across her chest, moved closer to her son. Since her divorce 7 years ago, she had avoided men altogether and, to be honest, feared them. "So, we're not going to introduce ourselves, I see." "Well, that's actually good," the old man drawled, looking somewhere vague with his crooked eyes. "What's the point of remembering you? This cursed pain, they killed the devil in the flesh. He gave up his body, but not his soul. His black shadow has been wandering here at night for 4 years now. But without a body, he can't kill." The old man fell silent and then looked intently at Marcus. "Listen, boy, don't even think about creating a body for the devil. I saw it in my dreams, and in my dreams, God speaks to me. You should just leave this cursed field altogether. If you stay, you'll bring disaster to my field too. I feel it. You're not here with good intentions. I saw it in a dream," the stranger said, glancing at the frightened mother and then shifting his gaze back to Marcus. This is private property. You'd better leave where you came from. Otherwise, I'll call the police," Marcus replied firmly. "Huh, been watching too many movies," the unpleasant old man chuckled, then turned and trudged back in the direction he had come from. "He'll call the police, look at him. People go wherever they please, especially the devil. But you, boy, don't create him. I warned you." The stranger muttered something else as he walked away, but the rustling of the corn drowned out his scratchy, hoarse mumbling. The young man turned to his mother, placed his hands on her shoulders, and, looking in her wide, frightened eyes, firmly said, "Everything's fine. Tomorrow I'll bring Duke." He hugged his mother. Catherine Whitmore, who had endured years of domestic violence at the hands of her husband, had stayed with him only for the sake of her son. As soon as Marcus turned 15 and started to resemble a man, she immediately filed for divorce. That evening, her drunken husband had tried to hit her again, but her son intervened. He pushed his father away with force, landing on his backside and lightly bumping his head against the wardrobe. The man forever remembered that the fragile social studies teacher now had protection. Mother and son turned and headed toward the house. The dwelling was a small 2-story building with several outbuildings. The house hadn't seen repairs or cleaning for a long time. The shack evoked mixed feelings in Marcus. On the one hand, it was their own house, small on the outside but quite spacious inside. On the other hand, it needed repairs, including re-roofing and repainting the walls. Thankfully, for a city dweller, the toilet was at least inside and not outdoors, as is often the case. All it lacked was a bathhouse or a bathtub, but that was a fixable issue with some funds. The young man had already picked out a shower cabin and found a spot for it. The house even had electricity and a gasoline generator in case of power outages. Essentially, with repairs and significant investment, it could become a very livable space. The next day, Marcus brought Duke, and Catherine Whitmore immediately felt calmer. After yesterday's visit from the neighbor, she was uneasy, especially since he had been rambling about shadows and the devil. The old man clearly suffered from a mental disorder, or maybe he had his eye on their plot and was trying to scare them off. As soon as the dog was on the field, he started running around like crazy and barking joyfully. Marcus watched Duke with a smile, occasionally giving commands like a proper master. "Hey, you furry face, don't go breaking all the corn, or what will I sell later?" Catherine Whitmore, with a faint smile, watched the dog's antics and caught herself thinking that she was starting to like it here too. Suddenly, Duke stopped in his tracks, sniffed the air, and a second later darted into the depths of the cornfield. "Hey, where are you going?" the boy called after the dog, but the black and brown fur was already hidden by the stalks of maize. Marcus glanced at his mother and shrugged. A minute later, Duke broke out into barking. The dog had found something and was calling for his owner. Following the sound, Marcus reached the dog, who, with his head raised, was barking loudly, occasionally pausing to dig into the ground. Between the rows of corn, a black piece of fabric was sticking out of the soil. Marcus pushed the dog aside and tugged at the edge of the fabric. Soon, a dirty coat was pulled out into the light. The boy laughed with delight, but the dog, staring at the find, continued to bark incessantly. "Will you calm down already?" The owner scolded Duke sternly and held the black coat out in front of him to examine it more closely. The dog whimpered in discontent and lay down between the rows, sadly watching the young man. After inspecting the item from all sides, Marcus slung it over his arm and called the dog to follow him as he headed home. An idea struck the budding farmer on the way: to make a scarecrow. After all, what kind of farm doesn't have a straw dummy? But there was no straw to be found, so the boy decided to stuff the scarecrow with whatever was available, namely leaves and corn stalks. The thick and sturdy stalks could serve as a frame, while the wide leaves would work as filler. Fueled by creative passion, the boys set to work. Marcus spent 2 days making the scarecrow. During this time, the dog didn't leave his owner's side and often burst into barking while staring at the developing dummy. Eventually, the young man stomped at the dog to silence him and, in the end, locked him in the barn altogether. Paying no mind to the dog's anxiety, the boy threw himself with fervor into creating a scarecrow for the cornfield. It had to be as terrifying as possible and resemble a human. Otherwise, what good would it do? After 2 days of painstaking work, the sentinel was ready. When he finished, Marcus, proud of himself, called his mother, who was sorting through old junk, packing it into boxes and bags. As soon as Catherine Whitmore stepped outside, she gasped, covered her mouth, and froze in place. The scarecrow turned out to be disturbingly lifelike. Lying on the grass to the right of the house's threshold was a dummy the size of an adult man. Its leafy legs were hidden in old black trousers tied at the waist with thick jute twine. The torso was covered by an old plaid shirt that had once been Marcus's favorite. But the most unsettling part was the head, made from burlap. What had once been a sack was now decorated by the boy, who had meticulously drawn on it with a black marker. Eyes in the shape of XS, like dead cartoon characters, and a sinister grin. Nearby lay a long black coat. As fate would have it, Marcus had taken the stalks and leaves from the center of the field, where a murderer had ended his own life. Catherine Whitmore, hugging herself and shivering, couldn't shake the unease she felt looking at the scarecrow. "Marcus, it's just so creepy. Maybe we shouldn't put it up," she said timidly. "That's the whole point, Mom," the young man replied cheerfully. "It's the guard of the cornfield. It's supposed to be scary. The scarier, the better. I still need to get it something for its head like they do in the movies." At that moment, Marcus remembered a wide-brimmed brown hat, like the one worn by the main antagonist in a popular horror movie where the evil awakened every 23rd autumn. His mother just shook her head and, asking him to place the monstrosity where it wouldn't be visible from her window, went back inside. Her son nodded in agreement and headed to the barn for some boards. He decided to make a cross for the scarecrow, like in every horror movie. By the end of the day, the cornfield's guardian, dressed in the black coat, was mounted on the cross at the edge of the field. That evening, the small family gathered at the table in their new home for the first time. Marcus, brimming with pride, set down boiled corn cooked in butter. But as soon as he bit into a cob, he jumped up and spat it into the trash can. His mother, grimacing in displeasure, used a napkin for the same purpose. The corn from the center of the field was bitter and tasted metallic. "Ugh, is it the variety?" Did that jerk plant some weird crap in the whole field? The boy cursed the previous owner and, plagued by suspicions, left the house to pick corn from various parts of the field. Before returning home, Marcus cast a brief glance at the scarecrow, and a cold wave ran down his spine. Yes, the scarecrow was truly terrifying. A light breeze ruffled the coat's hem, and the burlap head drooped limply onto one shoulder. It really did look like a person had been crucified in the field. Pleased with the effect, Marcus went back inside. The new corn was quickly boiled and fried in butter. It turned out delicious. It seemed only the center had that strange variety. The bitter maize was set aside for the dog. But Duke, arching his back, first growled at the boiled cobs and then began barking furiously at them. Surprised by the reaction, the young farmer simply threw out the bitter, metallic-tasting corn. But Catherine Whitmore flinched, remembering where she had tasted a similar flavor before. It reminded her of the time her ex-husband had knocked out one of her side teeth during an argument. The corn from the center of the field tasted like blood. A few days later, Marcus went to the city in the morning and returned after lunch with a wide-brimmed hat and his girlfriend, Freya. He also brought gasoline to test the generator. After taking the canister to the barn, he postponed the task for later. Proudly showing off the property, he invited Freya to see the scarecrow. But as they approached, the girl stopped 3 meters away from the dummy and said quietly, "Marcus, that thing is seriously creepy. Are you sure you need it?" "Of course," Marcus exclaimed, pleased with her reaction. Jumping onto the lower crossbeam, he placed the hat on the Sentinel. "Now it's even better. Doesn't it look just like something out of a horror movie?" A slender brunette only slowly nodded, keeping her gaze fixed on the scarecrow. Smiling, Marcus carefully jumped between the rows and called the girl into the house. On their way, they bought 2 pizzas and Mom's favorite cherry dumplings. Taking Freya by the hand, the young man led her through the cornfield, inspired by dreams of selling maize and making homemade bourbon. The girl glanced back for a moment and, pointing a finger toward the scarecrow, screamed, It looked at me. "Oh, come on, sweetheart. It's just a scarecrow. I made it myself a couple of days ago." Marcus pulled the girl close. She was trembling with fear, an effect the young man clearly hadn't intended. After standing in an embrace for a few minutes, Marcus kissed his beloved and, taking her by the hand, led her toward the house. He no longer planned to show her that terrifying thing again. Thankfully, it couldn't be seen from their bedroom window. Over the course of a week, the dilapidated little house gradually turned into a cozy nest, needing only minor repairs. Together, the 2 women tidied up, washed the windows, and made it so you could walk around barefoot on the floor. Marcus arranged for the house to be painted, looked for ways to sell the future harvest, and, of course, ordered a satellite dish with internet so he could comfortably work from home. Life was slowly getting better. By the end of August, the dreary rains typical of the season began, heralding the imminent arrival of autumn. All day, the wind drove clouds across the sky. Walking through the cornfield, and later toward evening, a golden lightning bolt sliced through the heavens. With a resonant thunderclap, the rain began to pour. Cold drops drummed on the roof, washed over the corn leaves, and soaked the scarecrow. Toward midnight, the bad weather intensified. Duke, the dog, didn't particularly like such weather and barked at every thunderclap, for which he was repeatedly scolded by his owner. Catherine Whitmore suggested throwing the dog outside, but her son was categorically against it. He had simply forgotten to build a kennel for the dog. The rain grew heavier, turning into a downpour, and by nightfall, the heavenly water was fiercely drenching the rows of the cornfield. This worried the inexperienced farmer. The dog, meanwhile, began howling. Marcus approached Duke and tried to calm him. Their loyal friend growled in response. The young man initially recoiled, but after a few seconds, noticed that the dog wasn't growling at him, but rather staring out the window. Turning around, Marcus saw that in the lightning flashes illuminating the living room windows, the dark silhouette of a corner was clearly visible. The young man tried to embrace the dog. Duke allowed it, but erupted in a wild barking, still staring out the window. Tired of listening to this, Marcus grabbed Duke by the collar and locked him in a far room. The dog, offended, stopped barking and lay down in front of the door. Meanwhile, the rain gradually eased, and an hour later, only drizzled mournfully, with sparse drops striking the roof, the windowsill, and the scarecrow's hat. Then the full moon emerged from behind the clouds, and the scarecrow shuddered and tried to leap off its cross. The ropes held it back. So, the scarecrow yanked its left arm with all its might. The sound of rustling corn leaves and snapping stalks filled the air, and the knot tightened. Another attempt, and the knot grew tauter, but the rope loosened. That was enough for the scarecrow to free its arm. Dry leaves mystically transformed, and soon, at the end of the sleeve, something resembling a hand appeared. Straw fingers tightened the knot on the right arm, and soon, the scarecrow was unbound and leapt to the ground, only to collapse immediately. The scarecrow was just learning to walk. Unable to get up, it lay among the living rows. Marcus glanced out the window by chance, and, to his surprise, discovered an empty cross where the guardian should have been. Throwing on a raincoat, the young man hurried to the field without saying a word to anyone. Seeing the scarecrow lying among the rows, Marcus grimaced in annoyance and looked at the sky. The full moon alternately disappeared and reappeared among the heavy rain-soaked clouds. Most likely, the rain would start again soon. It was better to take advantage of the temporary lull. "Damn it, how did you manage to fall?" muttered the farmer. Looking at the cross and noticing the tightened knots, the young man decided the scarecrow had gotten wet from the rain, causing the loops to tighten under its weight. But he really didn't want to deal with it at night, in the damp and without light. Deciding to postpone until morning, Marcus, muttering faint curses under his breath, lifted the rain-soaked, heavy scarecrow and dragged it toward the barn. Meanwhile, Duke began howling again, pleading with his owner not to do it. Huffing and puffing, Marcus hauled the scarecrow, dropped it on the barn floor near the generator, and without closing the door, headed back to the house. When he arrived, the women were grimly drinking tea, and the dog was practically tearing the door apart with its loud barking. "Marcus, just let him out already. I've got a headache," Catherine Whitmore snapped. The young man nodded briefly, opened the door, and Duke immediately darted out of the house. The farmer didn't even have time to react. The dog slipped through the open door and vanished into the night's darkness. "He'll come back when the storm passes," the woman reassured her son. Shrugging, Marcus approached the entrance and locked it. But by morning, Duke hadn't returned. Upset by the dog's disappearance, the farmer postponed all tasks and completely forgot about the scarecrow. Marcus sat silently, staring out the window, while the women busied themselves with household chores. Dinner also passed in silence, and immediately after the meal, the young couple went upstairs, while Catherine Whitmore stayed downstairs to take care of the kitchen before heading to sleep in the living room. She didn't want to go to her room. Darkness chased away the light, and night fell. On the neighboring farm, Grandpa Alfred sat indifferently watching TV, occasionally brightening his solitude with a shot of moonshine. He had lived alone for a long time, and half a bottle of strong alcohol before bed had become a tradition. Sleepiness began to creep over him. At 2 a.m, the cross-eyed old man jerked awake and jumped from his seat. He certainly wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at night. Not anticipating anything good, the grandfather tiptoed to the bedroom, took a double-barreled shotgun out of the wardrobe, and loaded it with 16-gauge shells. Approaching the door, Alfred rasped, "Who the hell's there?" The response was silence, apart from the rustling of corn leaves swayed by the wind. It couldn't have been his imagination. He had distinctly heard knocking at the door. The old man listened closely and then made out loud clucking in the barn. Someone had broken into the chicken coop. Gripping the shotgun tightly, the old man opened the door and stepped into the night. Tiptoeing toward the chicken coop, Alfred squinted into the pitch-black darkness. The clouds covered the sky, blocking out the moonlight. The old man's eyes weren't what they used to be. He blinked repeatedly, trying to focus his already skewed vision. And just as he neared the barn, he heard a rustle behind him. Grandpa Alfred spun around sharply, and the scream stuck in his throat like a lump. Standing before him was a living scarecrow, its black cross-stitch eyes intently watching him. The leaf-stuffed figure moved slowly, as if mocking or afraid of scaring him off, inching closer to the old man. Over the night, it had remembered how to walk and was doing a surprisingly good job of it. There were no more than 3 meters between them. Alfred's fingers trembled, but he mustered his strength and pulled the trigger. Then again, 2 shots rang out, but the buckshot only tore through the scarecrow's clothing without causing it the slightest harm. The resurrected maniac only staggered, then lunged at its victim. With a sweep of its right hand, sharp corn leaves slashed the old man from his throat to his groin. Grandpa Alfred, without uttering a sound, dropped his gun and reached for his spilling entrails. Another sweep, and the grass-like claws tore through his throat. Crimson blood gushed in a fountain, spraying fine droplets over the corn. The old man made one last attempt to stuff his guts back inside, but collapsed lifelessly. The scarecrow glanced indifferently at the corpse and headed toward Marcus's farm. Catherine Whitmore was finishing the dishes when a sound behind her made her drop the frying pan and turn sharply. Something had scraped iron against the glass. Debating whether to call her son, she decided to check the window first and scream loudly if necessary. Stealthily moving through the dim light, she approached within 2 meters of the source and began to peer out. She exhaled in relief. It was just a shovel scraping the glass as Marcus leveled the ground in front of the porch. Scolding herself for worrying, Catherine Whitmore decided not to disturb the young ones and carry the tool to the shed herself. Opening the door and carefully glancing around, she stepped into the night. But she hadn't gone 3 meters before a thick hemp rope with a noose at the end was thrown around her neck and tightened as someone pushed against her back. It all happened so quickly that the terrified woman couldn't even scream, managing only a faint rasp. She reached for the noose, but the pressure between her shoulder blades increased, and she fell first to her knees, then onto her right side. The scarecrow climbed on her back and pulled the noose tight. A dull crunch sounded in her throat. Catherine Whitmore, using her last bit of strength to resist, soon fell silent. Picking up her body, the scarecrow slung it over its shoulder and headed toward the center of Feed Field, disappearing into the serenely swaying corn. Marcus slept restlessly. He was having nightmares. Duke, his dog, was running away from him through the cornfield. He called out, tried to catch up, but it was futile. The dense corn swallowed the dog, and soon it vanished from sight. Then a scream rang out, a long, drawn-out woman's scream. Marcus turned and saw his mother. She stood between the rows, waving farewell to him. The young man tried to run to her, but his legs were stuck in blood-soaked soil. When he looked again, the woman was surrounded by swirling dry corn leaves. Marcus, letting out a soft cry, woke up. Freya was peacefully asleep next to him. He kissed her and, turning to the other side, fell back asleep. But the kiss woke Freya. Grumbling in annoyance, she decided to get some water and return to bed. Going down to the kitchen, she grabbed a faceted glass and immediately noticed the unwashed dishes in the sink. Neat Catherine Whitmore would never leave things like that. Deciding to check on her future mother-in-law, she headed toward her room. Passing by the threshold, Freya was even more surprised. The front door was open. She reached out a hand but was immediately grabbed by the wrist and yanked outside. Frightened, Freya screamed. Hearing her cry, Marcus instantly woke up and, bumping into furniture in the dark, rushed downstairs. But he was met only by the wide-open door and the fading sound of a scream. The Scarecrow strangled the girl and threw her next to Catherine Whitmore and poor Duke in the center of the field. They were destined to be sacrifices for the one who, in exchange for others' lives, granted immortality. Stunned, Marcus ran to his mother's room. She wasn't there. Remembering she planned to sleep in the living room, he rushed downstairs, but she wasn't there either. On the verge of hysteria, the young man grabbed the phone off the shelf and was about to dial the police when he heard a cold voice behind him. Put down the phone. Marcus turned, and the phone slipped from his hands. Standing in the doorway was the Scarecrow. Its cloak, shirt, and pants were covered in dried bloodstains, and through the torn hole in the burlap sack, a human eye gleamed where its right button eye had been. The Scarecrow began to change. As it took lives, it grew stronger, partially restoring its organs. The young man tried to flee, but fear made his legs feel like jelly, and he stumbled away unsteadily. The Scarecrow caught up in 2 leaps, knocked him down, smashed his face into the floor a couple of times, and flipped him over. "I won't kill you," came a voice from somewhere inside. "You brought me back, even sacrificed your favorite shirt. Now I need your help." Grabbing Marcus by the hair, the Scarecrow dragged him to his feet and hauled him outside toward the shed. Stopping in front of it, the resurrected killer turned the trembling Marcus toward him and asked, "Do you have paint?" "Yes, I do," the young man lied, remembering the canister of gasoline. A plan for revenge was forming in his mind. "Don't lie. I was there. There's only a generator and tools." The cornleaf fingers tightened their grip on his hair, accidentally cutting his scalp. In the other shed, there's paint." Marcus gritted through his teeth, barely enduring the pain. "Good. Now run. And when I come out, I don't want to see you here. Don't bother about your women. Or the dog. They're gone." The Scarecrow threw its creator to the ground and walked into the dark shed. Shaking with fear, Marcus jumped to his feet and grabbed a large plank lying nearby, using it to bar the door. A thud sounded. The Scarecrow realized it was trapped. Another blow, but the door held firm. The Scarecrow roared furiously and began pounding again and again, trying to break free. Frightened Marcus entered the shed nearby and, grabbing a canister of gasoline, rushed to the structure where the Scarecrow was raging. He had to hurry. The creature had almost broken down the door. Placing the gasoline on the ground, the young man ran home and returned with matches for the gas stove. His hands were trembling treacherously. His fingers barely managed to unscrew the canister's lid. Dousing the shed, where the furious Scarecrow was roaring inside, with fuel, the young man struck a match, but it immediately went out. He closed his eyes and tried to calm himself. His fingers were shaking uncontrollably. Exhaling several times, Marcus tried again and finally lit a match, bringing it to the spot where he had poured the gasoline. A bright flash and fire engulfed the wooden shed. The Scarecrow roared even more furiously and was now trying to break through the boards on the roof. But the fire spread over the structure with each passing moment, leaving no chance for escape. Stepping back a few paces, Marcus watched the flames dance. His thoughts fled, leaving his soul utterly empty. Like a shadow of his former self, he trudged toward the exit. The young man sat on the road, the flames reflected in his eyes. Soon, the fire would be visible in the city, and the Ministry of Emergency Situations would be called. He watched hopelessly as his dream, his farm, his home, and most importantly, the bodies of his loved ones were consumed by the flames. His mind was blank. No thoughts, no emotions. It was as if he had been gutted, as though everything had been taken from him. And then, from behind, came the sound of footsteps and the rustling of corn leaves. A strong smell of burning filled the air. Marcus turned and gazed indifferently at the charred scarecrow. It had managed to break down the door and escape. The scarecrow was in no hurry to attack. It too remained silent. They stood wordlessly for about a minute, as the cornfield was increasingly consumed by fire. "You created me," the killer broke the silence. "But you also try to kill me. Consider us even. If I see you again, I'll kill you." The scarecrow, glancing toward the city, recalled those who had caused its life to end. It stepped off the road, and the corn concealed its dark figure. And the now mad Marcus watched indifferently as everything most precious to him burned away.